Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's event, APAP ArtsForward Monthly Reopening Webinar. My name is Willie Santiago, and I am the Manager of Programs and Resources at the Association of Performing Arts Professionals. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm a fair-skinned Hispanic person with short, brown, wavy hair, brown eyes, and I'm wearing a purple and pink and blue checkered shirt. APAP is located in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and the Anacostan people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. I would like to pay my respects to the Piscataway and Anacostan elders, both past and present. Closed captioning will appear automatically on your screen. If you would like to disable the chat transcript, please click More on the bottom of the Zoom window and hide subtitle. We are joined by ASL interpreters from Purple, Melanie Gardner and Julie Miller. Thank you both for collaborating with us this afternoon. Participants on today's webinar will have the opportunity to ask questions and provide comments using the Q&A chat functions. If you have questions, we ask that you submit them using the Q&A box. We would like to remind you that APAP is your go-to resource for the connections and resources you need to build your career as a performing arts professional in the presenting, booking, and touring field. Join APAP as we move the arts forward. We know that right now, many in our field are still recovering from the impacts of the pandemic. And for that reason, APAP is offering flexible no barriers membership through June 2022. If you are interested in joining APAP and learning more about our flexible membership dues, contact us at info@apap365.org. I'll now turn things over to our Director of Programs and Resources, Krista Bradley.
Thanks, Willie. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Today's session is part of our ArtsForward program initiative, made possible with the generous support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. APAP's ArtsForward program supports the presenting and touring field safe, vibrant, and equitable reopening and recovery as presenters, artists, and audiences reconnect, tours resume, and venues reopen. On February 9th, as part of ArtsForward, back in a couple months ago, APAP launched the APAP ArtsForward Reopening Survey with our research partners and colleagues, AMS Planning and Research. The important 8-month long-term initiative will gather invaluable longitudinal data from performing arts presenters, venues, agents and managers, producers, and artists, as well as track field-wide trends in reopening and resuming programming, booking, and touring activities. The resulting report will provide the industry with national and regional data to inform decision-making as presenters, producers, artists, and audiences come back together and we resume a vibrant recovery. Today, we'll be learning findings from the third deployment of the reopening survey, which was administered to presenters and venues across the country. This is the first time we're getting a chance to see some data from the baseline that we did a couple of months ago. So I'm really curious to hear what our friends at AMS have to report and how that's tracking for your experience. We encourage you to use the chat or make comments, and we look forward to having a robust Q&A discussion after we learn more from AMS Planning and Research. One other thing that I want to tell you about is that we'll run this survey every month for the next few months until September, and we'll deploy the survey to different facets of our sector every other month. And we have incentives for actually filling out that survey, and we can talk more about that at the end. I want to express our gratitude again to the Mellon Foundation for their support and our deep appreciation for AMS Planning and Research team and their partnership. We're joined today by Stephen Wolf, Principal of AMS Planning and Research, and Christian Otten, Project Manager at AMS, who will lead us through the findings. Thank you for being here, Stephen and Christian. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Krista. It's great to be with everybody again and to be able to share this third version of our survey. Christian and I are going to take you fairly quickly through some data, excuse me, and we really do look forward to a discussion. So please feel free to put some insights in the chat as we go along or to put questions in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to everyone. So as Krista mentioned, this is the third administration. It's the second of our administrations to venues and presenters. Next slide, please, Christian. As you know, there are 2 parallel surveys. Each will be administered 4 times. Venues and presenters, agents, artists, and artist managers being the 2 cohorts, with a core focus on the volume of activity, but also looking at how reopening is progressing, challenges and opportunities that folks are feeling, and thoughts that you might have going forward. This second iteration of the survey had about the same response as the first. It was about 204 the first time. This time it's about 195. We really appreciate the participation of folks in the field. Those of you who are here, we encourage you to encourage your colleagues to participate in the survey. The list that we're sending invitations to was generated through the good offices of several APAP partners at South Arts, Mid-Atlantic, and New England presenters. We had a good national distribution this time, about 32% in the Northeast, 25% in the South, just under 20% in the Midwest, and 23% in the West Coast. We had a good distribution, as we did in February, nationally, and among different kinds of presenters and venues. Presenters with venues, venue operators only, and presenters only. So we think that really helps us look at the data with our goal of a longitudinal trend and where we see we're headed. So what's the top line? So the top line is that we continue to have growth in the number of venues and presenters that are offering full capacity programs. We're up to about 71%. That's a 30% improvement from our survey just 2 months ago. You do note that there is still a significant difference between the Northeast and the rest of the country, both in who has currently planned, is currently offering full capacity performances now, those that will add them between now and the end of the summer, and in fact, organizations that will not really be resuming until the fall of 22, if you will, the 22-23 season. Similarly, in the last 30 days, we've seen a change, if you will, a reduction in this case, in the number of presenters or venues that are offering less than 10 in-person performances a month. This is a gain, again, from 70% to 53%, so 16 points or roughly 20% gain, 22% reduction in the total level of activity. So despite being open, we see that organizations are averaging far fewer events than they did 3 years ago in 2019. One of the things that's probably predictable, and we like to say all the time with good research that some of what we see should confirm what we already know. Presenters that operate or use their own venues are the most active of our 3 cohorts. Presenters who are only presenters who are effectively renting venues in other in and across their market are the least active at this point in time. And again, we see the difference with the Northeast, excuse me, fairly far behind the rest of the regions of the country. Another very significant change from our February survey is the amount of activity that has been rescheduled. Now what we see is that less than a quarter of the activity that was presented in April was rescheduled activity. That suggests that we're moving forward, we're recovering from what we lost in the pandemic. So those early indicators around activity itself are quite positive. We see significant increases in volume, significant new activity taking place. There is always an other side of the coin. And as we look at ticket sales in particular, the news is not as positive, though more positive than it was in February. fully 80% of responding organizations indicated that their subscription sales are behind the prior baseline year, the 2019 year. As you look region by region, you'll see some of this is improved from the prior period, and some of it is somewhat worse than it was when we conducted this survey in February. Similarly, with single ticket sales, we have a substantial group of people who are saying, yes, they're behind where they were in our last full season. But in this case, 3 of the 4 regions say they're better than they were just 2 months ago. So we're seeing some gains there that suggests perhaps more readiness to come out. Christian's going to talk about what sort of things might be affecting this. And as you just saw pop onto your screen, from our other research, we know that 54% of audiences who came during our 2019 seasons are actually bought tickets in April, which is the biggest number that we've seen in 20 months, right, Christian, of our other Audience Outlook Monitor work. Let me turn it over to you here for the next bunch of slides.
Thanks, Stephen. So overall, some interesting and positive things, as well as some metered growth. We want to turn and take a look at how actual attendance is being affected. And we've been studying this concept of a drop count for some time now. And we see some differences regionally, but overall, we see that about half of the organizations are saying that their drop counts are lower, meaning that fewer ticket buyers are attending relative to pre-pandemic. That figure is essentially consistent with what we saw in February. The question is, why is some of that happening? And some of the data that we have from that Audience Outlook Monitor indicates to us that some concerns are on the rise relative to even February and March, in part possibly due to the advent of the BA.2 variant of Omicron. We see an increase across audience segments broadly in the concern around gathering in large numbers relative to March figures that we studied, as well as concern about the duration of immunity due to being vaccinated. So some of those things might be impacting the drop counts that we see, and people deciding at the last minute perhaps not to attend, as well as some changing and shifting factors and health and safety protocols in different venues with different presenters. So we see, continued investment in remaining active in the sector outside of ticketed events in particular here. Some growth in providing free content among a lot of the venues and the presenters that we have surveyed here. We also see, relatively strong numbers in terms of those that are offering residencies and artist workshops and those sort of things, master classes, commissioning new work, providing financial support for artists on an ongoing basis here, as well as some of the works in progress showings. So there's development happening and there's investment in artists and in communities that transcends the ticketed performances. We also wanted to understand, ever since the last survey, we've seen a lot of action in the war in Ukraine, and wanted to understand whether venues and presenters were engaging in any kind of activities in support of Ukraine. We saw that about 1 in 5 venues or presenters are offering programs or support opportunities for Ukraine, and they vary here. You see a lot of readings of Ukrainian plays in support of Ukrainian artists, fundraising performances, as well as just some visibility on social media and in the physical spaces in support of Ukraine. I'm going to turn it over to Stephen, I believe, and he wants to talk a little bit about what the workforce is looking like.
Thanks, Christian. One of the things that we're really quite concerned about is how we bring our workforce back. As of April, it looks like about 97% of our full-time positions are now refilled. not necessarily with the same people, but the jobs are refilled, and that's about 4 points higher than it was in February. So statistically, roughly the same. The bigger difference is in terms of the part-time workforce, and this correlates with the gain in activity. So now just about 3/4 of part-time staff are back working at traditional regular hours compared to before the pandemic, but another 19% are working less, and the remaining 8% of positions probably haven't yet been filled. But this is about a 15 or 18% gain from just 2 months ago. So it does correlate quite accurately with the increase in activity. Again, we see geographic differences. On the full-time side, slightly more folks working anywhere but the Northeast, where the volume increase has not yet happened. And interestingly, on the part-time side, more reliance or less presence of part-time staff back in the Midwest appears to be more reliant on the full-time staff. No really significant differences in rural setting for the full-time folks, and a fairly big change or difference in the rural return to work in the rural venues and presenters, with only 4 in 10 back to work. Okay. One of the things that we tested really important is how are you doing at recruiting people? How are you doing at getting folks back to work? And what we see in April is that it's getting harder and harder to fill open positions, that as folks return to the workforce, as we are all very aware of, a greater call for work-life balance, for increased compensation. We see folks are departing the art sector for other kinds of employment, and that we're really having to compete with folks that we didn't have to compete with before. This is no doubt a topic that deserves its own kind of conversation as we go forward, and I'm sure that APAP will think about that. And that goes to the question that somebody asked about demographics of the workforce. We don't know the answer to that question, but we will come back with that if we can figure out a way to ask it. And Christian, back to you, I think, to talk some about health and safety.
Absolutely. So we found some interesting correlations between what audiences are expecting, again, from our audience outlook monitor, the data that we collected throughout the middle of April. And we're seeing, and the correlation there with what venues are doing. We'll make some observations there as we go forward here. Overall, we're seeing that just under half of the audiences surveyed in April still believe that mask mandates are necessary. Obviously, there's some pretty significant regional drivers here, as we've discussed, the Northeast region being the primary region that's pushing the presence of mask mandates in particular. But overall, that figure has held steady relative to March, which gives us some context around the sort of protocols that are being put in place by venues and by presenters. We see a pretty significant drop in mask mandates overall among the sample that was surveyed in April. Interestingly, in light of what the expectations are around audiences, there is a sense that vaccination for admittance is also not quite as necessary as it might have been overall across the sample back in February relative to April. So overall, we see most venues and presenters have dropped their mask mandates and their vaccination. We've only got about 30% across the board here. Presumably, that represents a bigger portion of the Northeast region. We don't have a slide for that, but I'm pretty sure that's the answer to that question. Back to the audience context here. Around vaccinated only admittance, we still see a pretty significant portion of the population that's expecting or is more likely to attend given vaccinated only admittance policies. And in fact, since March, we've seen that hold steady, whereas over the last couple of months, the expectation has been dropping. Again, in light of what has been going on nationwide with slight COVID upticks, those sort of things, it gives us some context there. Also, a really interesting observation here, we've seen the data on this relative to February, but we still see that the primary drivers around expectations and the sort of things that our venues and presenters are putting in place here are driven by regional expectations. So in the Northeast, again, you've got nearly 60% expecting proof of vaccination and expecting mask mandates, whereas all the other regions across the country have lessened their mandates and their protocols. Anything you want to add there, Stephen, before we continue?
No, I don't think so. I think just to summarize, and before we do that, to ask everybody who's listening in today, if there are any questions or queries, please post them in the Q&A so that we can get to them. And to remind everybody that this is the second of 4 venue and presenter surveys. We'll be in the field, I think, Christian, in about a week's time with the second of the artist and artist manager surveys. So where are we? I think that the immediate picture is that as a field, we continue to recover. Our volume of activity is increasing, but sales are leaving us with a lot of question marks. There's a lot of conversation nationally amongst practitioners and some researchers. I've been on a number of calls about maybe we're not returning to where we were. Maybe there's a more fundamental reset, and we'll be exploring that in the weeks ahead. Staffing seems to have really recovered on the full-time side, but I just saw somebody post in the chat the difficulty about hiring sort of line staff and part-time staff, which is, we're not the only industry experiencing that. We expect that that's going to drive changes in the economic balance about how much it costs to produce. And then finally, people, whether requirements are down or not, we know that arts audiences expect our venue operators, our artists, our programs, and we know our artists themselves expect us to be thinking about their health and safety in these uncertain times as we go forward. So that remains on the radar in a big way. From there, I think it would be great if Krista could rejoin us. We'll answer a couple of questions. And I saw one come back up in the Q&A that we can sort of get to right away. The question was related, I think, to the data that we gathered around the Ukraine. And do organizations notice any more purchases, positive feedback, or even donations in the weeks after they visibly convey support for the Ukraine? That's a question actually that I push back to those of you that are online with us. We'd love to hear from you. As we adjust the questionnaire for the next administration, I think that would be a great sort of, if you did something, can you tell us about it kind of response. Those are the kinds of things we love to hear, and we'll absolutely probe on.
That sounds great. And this was really interesting. It's clear that we're coming back, but that we're not coming back in the way that we expected or that we have been, right? You know, because we keep hearing these discussions that it's people are not coming back in droves, or they're not coming back as frequently. And so what does that mean in terms of how we market, how we budget, how we program? These are not questions, but just observations and things that I think are percolating in the field, as lots of researchers seem to be having the same question. I did want to ask about this whole, it seems like a bit of a disconnect between our audiences and communities expecting and wanting us to have some sort of vaccination protection, and yet our venues not necessarily feeling like they need to do that, and I just wonder how we reconcile that. I also wonder how that impacts our touring artists, which we'll hear from next month. But just any observations or thoughts about that?
I think I don't want to move beyond the data that we know. I think that probably important. It's important to say that there is no doubt a sort of social desirability bias component of audience response. Like my mom used to say to me, "Don't do what I do what I say." I also think that there's a practical application problem, and that's the challenge I think we see venues dealing with, right? What is the guidance we're being given by CDC, or more recently during this survey window, the courts themselves? At the same time, our artists and those that represent them and advocate for them are very concerned about their ability to pursue their livelihoods. So we have a set of what happens in the back door kind of activity, different maybe than what happens in the front door. We are seeing in some of our other research, for example, people wanting the option, audience members wanting the option to reseat themselves into less crowded areas of the auditorium if they feel uncomfortable. Certainly everybody that we talk to that is an operator, anecdotally, is saying that masks are always welcome. They just may not be required anymore. As for vaccine checking, that's still very much a Northeast thing. It has declined dramatically elsewhere.
Thanks for that clarification and just observation on that. I had a question, just a clarification. When you talked about the amount of activity being rescheduled, I think your note was that it was less than 25% were rescheduled. So does that mean that more events that took place in this last period were new bookings versus rescheduled from the past?
That's correct.
Okay.
A really significant increase in new bookings. And just to connect it for those online with us today that might not have been here for our artist agent and artist manager survey, I would encourage you to look up the online resource on the APAP website and see how their activity has returned. And I think we will see in our May survey of those folks a growth that parallels the decline in rescheduled activity, if that makes sense to everybody.
Sure. One of the other things that we're hearing anecdotally is that because people are not returning in the way that folks have expected, and because costs are higher now because our production tech folks are hard to come by, or they don't want to do what they did for the amount of money that they did, that it's harder to make your budget work for shows, right? Because the end revenue is kind of less and the costs are kind of higher. So I guess I would be curious in the next round just to hear how some of this is impacting people's decision making and programming decision making. Anecdotally, we're hearing that the risk taking is waning a little bit, and safer choices might be on the horizon. Might be on the horizon, but I just wanted to throw that out, and I don't know if anybody on the call actually has experienced some of that, but that seems to be bubbling up a lot in our membership.
Christian, any thoughts on how we might do that?
Yeah, I think that's something that we can address and talk a little bit about. We may actually have some data on that. As it turns out, we just didn't happen to share it here. As we think about the primary concerns that people have, they've talked a little bit about programming, and certainly we've seen a trend. That there's a sense that risk aversion over the last 6 months or so has kind of been the course. Curious to see, as things potentially stabilize and activity increases, what that mix looks like. So.
Laura makes a really interesting point too, because I have not heard this as much, but that artist fees have increased 25 to 50% compared to the prior period, and I do wonder about that. I would suspect that some of the costs are higher, travel's higher, insurance is higher, everything, all the costs are more. I would think that was kind of what the drivers are there, but it will be curious to ask our artists and agents and managers about the increased cost and the types of fees that they're asking for now and what's driving that. There seems to be another question here. Can you see this? Is there any indication as to which season, 21-22, 22-23, we are capturing data on? For example, we just launched our 22-23 season, but the data I was commenting on in this survey was for 21-22. I am only now coming into new subscription sales data.
I think that question is actually answering it the way we believe people are answering it, is that people should be referring to the season they're in. And we will be actually more careful as we make the transition as the surveys advance into next year's sales to talk specifically about 22-23.
Good. I believe we have a raised hand with Manuel Prestamo. So I would invite Manuel to share his comment or his question.
No, sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
Oh.
I'm happy to listen. Thank you.
Thanks, Manuel. Sorry. Okay, put your hand down, or the imaginary hand that we thought we saw.
Krista, we had one other question about intermissions that there lots of people had eliminated intermissions because of the moving around and the crowding and the social distancing issues, and whether or not they're coming back. I think that's another question that it would be great to ask in both of the surveys. I do know anecdotally from some of our other work with other venues that, generally speaking, intermissions are coming back, food and beverage sales are coming back, food in the auditorium is coming back pretty significantly. It's a big revenue item for a lot of places, and it's part of making the math work as higher costs get increased. And I see we're seeing from Mr. Mojo that he's reporting, or she's reporting, that expenses are essentially double what they were. That creates a really interesting question for the field, right? Because ticket pricing is probably somewhat inelastic to start with, or at least we seem to think it is as a field. But more importantly, as we're trying to serve accessibility issues, inclusion and equity issues going forward, raising ticket prices is not the only solution. And it will be really interesting as we go over the next months to see what that does to the availability of product.
Yeah, it's that's a big issue, and as we've talked to funders and other people about what really brings on a full recovery, will the costs even out in a year and a half? Because inflation seems to be the explanation for everything. So will that even out so that even if people are underwritten in some way, will that fix itself? Or are we looking at just a fixed kind of new way of business that's going to cost more money? That's a question. And then the other piece, just anecdotally, that we heard from a series of agents and presenters that do classical music. Our committee was talking, and their sense was that intermissions, that many people like the no intermission programming, that people like not sitting for 2 or 3 hours. And so some of their folks are trying to figure out ways to keep a hold of some of these programmatic innovations, because it's yielding a different kind of response from audience members, and they're actually enjoying it. So that's just an interesting thing to ask. So I'm curious what we'll hear from people thinking about how they think about their programming, not only what they're programming, but how they program it and how they deliver it, in terms of shortened versions, back-to-backs, residencies. Just, I think that might be something we want to look into, since these factors are really impact so many different things. I don't think there are any other questions, but I do see Lisa Richards-Tony
I will
on.
understand you much better if I can get familiar with the way you talk.
So I don't know if Lisa, if you had any questions or comments. I just wanted to give you that opportunity, and then just give it to Stephen and Christian to wrap up if we need to.
Okay. I don't, and I apologize that I'm late, but I will catch up with the notes. But thank you all for being here, and I really need to catch up with this. So I hope it was an informative session.
Thanks, Lisa. We'll certainly bring you up to date.
Okay.
I want to thank everybody who joined us. I do want to remind you, I think, Crystal, at the end, where you can find the resources after today's call. They will be posted. I want to really encourage those of you that are participating in the survey to continue to do so. Those who complete all 4 will be part of our pool for a drawing of both gift cards and membership. And really encourage that. The data, the longitudinal nature of this data is important. We can even see it here in just this first look at time 1 back in February and time 2 here in April. And I think the questions that were raised today will really help us on revisions for the 3rd edition of the survey. Everything from paid capacity sold to intermissions to costs, I think are areas that we'll definitely think about. Finding a way to collect some data. I encourage you to be in touch with APAP. If you, all right, Mr. Mojo, now you're.
Thanks,
now you're
Mr.
playing with
Mojo.
us. It's not 85 degrees here in the Northeast. Before I give it back to you, Krista, I absolutely want to thank Christian for all his hard work. I really want to thank Mel and Julie for their interpretation for us. It really helps us to make sure that everybody who wants to connect with us can. So thank the 2 of you for your effort. And back to you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Christian, and just thank you for all your work that you're doing, and echoing our friends at Purple. Thank you for your enormous skills and ensuring that we're being as inclusive as possible. I just want to underscore the fact that your voices matter. I think 2 things. When you participate in this survey, you're helping us get a better sense of the field, and for you to get a better insight on how you fit, to hopefully inform decision making. It also this is an iterative process. So the more you participate, the more we discuss, we see other questions that we might want to ask. So I think that's a really amazing dynamic opportunity that we have here. So I just want to encourage you all, and thank you for continuing to participate. Get others people to do so. And as Stephen said, we are giving away both gift cards. I believe they're $100 gift cards, as well as free conference registration. So that's even more incentive for you to actually do this. So thanks again for coming today, and we look forward to hearing from you. If you have any questions, just reach out. Thank you.